It is 1923, and in Berlin, a woman carries a wheelbarrow full of cash to buy a single loaf of bread. She sets the money on the counter. The baker looks at the pile, then at the woman. He tells her the price has gone up since she left the house. She needs twice as much. She has no more. She leaves with nothing. In the time it took her to walk to the bakery, the German mark had lost half its value. This is the image most people carry when they think of Germany between the wars. Hyperinflation, economic chaos, a nation reduced to burning currency for fuel because it was cheaper than firewood. But what that image conceals is something far more important. Something that explains not just how Germany fell, but how it rose again. How it built, in just 6 years, the most fearsome military machine Europe had ever seen. How did a bankrupt, humiliated nation, stripped of its colonies, its industry, and its pride, become the terror of an entire continent? The answer has very little to do with tanks or generals. It has everything to do with money. In June 1919, the victorious powers gathered at the Palace of Versailles to dictate terms to a defeated Germany. The Great War had consumed nearly 20 million lives. France lay scarred by 4 years of occupation. Britain had buried an entire generation. The mood was not mercy, it was vengeance. Under Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war. This was not symbolism, it was mathematics. Because accepting guilt meant accepting the bill. In 1921, the bill arrived. 132 billion gold marks, the equivalent of $33 billion at the time. Adjusted for inflation, roughly 400 billion today. Germany had already lost 13% of its territory, 12% of its population, nearly half its iron production, and a significant portion of its coal. Its army had been slashed to 100,000 men. Its navy was a skeleton. It could not manufacture heavy weapons, military aircraft, or submarines. It was a nation disarmed, diminished, and drowning in debt. The British economist John Maynard Keynes had warned against this. He resigned from the British Treasury delegation at Versailles in protest. In 1919, he published a book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. In it, he wrote that the reparations were many times more than Germany could ever pay. He called the treaty a Carthaginian peace, a reference to Rome's complete annihilation of its ancient enemy. He predicted that demanding the impossible would produce only catastrophe. He was right, but not in the way most people assume. The conventional narrative tells us that the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh, that German resentment over its terms fueled the rise of Hitler. This is true, as far as it goes, but it misses the deeper current. The real problem was not just that the treaty was punitive, it was that the entire international financial system built to enforce it created a web of debts, dependencies, and hidden flows of capital that would eventually strangle Europe. Here is what actually happened. Germany could not pay. This should have surprised no one. The economy was shattered. By 1923, hyperinflation had spiraled so completely out of control that the mark traded at 4.2 trillion to $1 American. Savings evaporated overnight. Pensions became worthless. The middle class, the traditional bedrock of stability, was wiped out. When Germany defaulted on its coal and timber deliveries, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of the country. German workers responded with passive resistance. The government paid them by printing money. The presses ran day and night. The currency dissolved. And then something unexpected happened. In late 1923, with Europe on the edge of financial collapse, the Reparations Commission formed a committee of experts to find a solution. The chairman was an American banker named Charles Dawes. What he proposed would change the course of history. The Dawes Plan, adopted in 1924, did two things. First, it restructured German reparation payments, making them manageable in the short term. Second, and far more importantly, it opened the gates for American capital to flood into Germany. Germany was loaned 800 million Reichsmarks to stabilize its currency and rebuild its economy. Half of this came from Wall Street. J.P. Morgan floated the loan, and American investors, flush with cash during the Roaring '20s, snapped it up. Over the next 4 years, American banks lent Germany enormous sums. By 1929, foreign loans worth more than 10 billion Reichsmarks had poured into the country. This created a bizarre circular flow of money. American banks lent to Germany. Germany used the money to pay reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain used those reparation payments to service their war debts to the United States. American capital flowed out, circled the Atlantic, and flowed right back in. Everyone seemed to win. American investors earned interest. Germany rebuilt. France and Britain got their money. The golden 20s arrived. German unemployment fell. Industrial production soared. The Weimar Republic finally seemed stable. But there was a flaw, hidden in plain sight. Germany was not generating the wealth to pay its debts. It was borrowing the money to pay them. The entire edifice rested on a single assumption, that American credit would keep flowing forever. On October 24, 1929, that assumption died. Black Thursday, the Wall Street crash. When American banks failed, they called in their foreign loans. The river of capital that had sustained Germany dried up overnight. Between 1929 and 1932, German industrial production fell by roughly 40%. Unemployment skyrocketed from 1.4 million to over 6 million. By 1932, 1 in 3 German workers had no job. Wages fell by nearly 40%. Banks collapsed. Businesses shuttered. People starved. The government's response made things worse. Fearing a return of hyperinflation, Chancellor Heinrich Brüning imposed austerity. He cut spending. He cut wages. He cut at the exact moment the economy needed stimulus. It was economic self-strangulation on a national scale. And into this void stepped Adolf Hitler. In the 1928 elections, the Nazi Party had won just 2.6% of the vote. They were a fringe movement, dismissed by most Germans as extremists and cranks. The Great Depression changed everything. By September 1930, with unemployment ravaging the country, the Nazis surged to 18.3%, becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag. By July 1932, they had captured 37%. Historians have long debated the exact relationship between economic conditions and Nazi voting. Recent research provides striking clarity. A 2019 study published by the Center for Economic Policy Research found that cities more exposed to failing German banks saw dramatically higher support for the Nazi Party. When Deutsche Bank and Dresdner Bank collapsed in 1931, triggering a full-blown financial crisis, the political landscape transformed. The researchers found that income declines driven by bank failures strongly increased votes for Hitler. A 1 standard deviation decline in income was associated with a 4.3% rise in Nazi support. But it was not just economic. Even after controlling for income loss, higher exposure to failing banks directly increased Nazi voting. The trauma of watching financial institutions collapse, the fear and uncertainty it generated, made people more susceptible to extremist messages promising order and stability. Hitler understood this perfectly. He promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles. He promised to restore German pride. He promised to rebuild the military and create jobs. And he had financial backing. German industrialists, terrified of communism and eager for a strong hand, poured money into the party. Men like Fritz Thyssen, the steel magnate, funded Hitler directly. On January 30, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. He had not won an outright majority. He had not staged a coup. He had been handed power through backroom dealings among conservative politicians who thought they could control him. They were wrong. Now comes the part of the story that complicates everything. Because Hitler did not rebuild Germany's military machine alone, he had help. And some of that help came from places that would later become his enemies. In October 1936, the United States ambassador to Nazi Germany, William Dodd, wrote a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt. In it, he reported that more than 100 American corporations had subsidiaries in Germany or cooperative understandings with the Nazi regime. Consider Ford. Henry Ford was not merely a businessman who happened to do business with Germany. He was a committed anti-Semite whose writings directly influenced Hitler. Ford's newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, published a series of articles in the early 1920s alleging a Jewish conspiracy to control America. These were compiled into 4 volumes called The International Jew. Hitler read them in German translation. He kept a portrait of Henry Ford in his office. In Mein Kampf, he praised Ford as the only American who had resisted Jewish influence. In July 1938, Hitler awarded Henry Ford the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest decoration Nazi Germany could bestow on a foreigner. Ford accepted it. Ford's German subsidiary, Ford Werke, operated throughout the Nazi period. Construction of Ford trucks in Cologne was completed just in time for Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. Between 1942 and 1944, the Ford plant in Cologne built approximately 10,000 half-tracks for the German army. By 1942, of the Wehrmacht's 350,000 trucks in service, roughly 1 in 3 was produced at Ford factories in the Reich. A United States Army report dated September 5, 1945, directly accused Ford's German subsidiary of serving as an arsenal of Nazism, at least for military vehicles, with the knowledge and consent of the parent company in Dearborn, Michigan. Then there was General Motors. GM's Opel division was the largest automaker in Germany. Together, Ford and General Motors controlled 70% of the German auto market at the outbreak of war in 1939. They quickly retooled to supply military trucks for the invasions of Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. The head of General Motors at the time, James Mooney, was an admirer of Hitler. Like Ford, he received the Grand Cross of the German Eagle. Perhaps no story is more chilling than that of IBM. The Nazi regime made extensive use of Hollerith punch card machines manufactured by IBM's German subsidiary, Deutsche Hollerith Maschinen GmbH, known as Dehomag. This technology was critical to Nazi census operations, which were used to identify Jews and other targeted groups. The machines tracked prisoners in concentration camps, cataloged their movements, and managed the logistics of mass murder. Each camp operated a Hollerith department. SS personnel were trained by IBM technicians. The company has since made generous donations to Holocaust memorial funds, but the fundamental charges have never been denied. Standard Oil of New Jersey maintained close ties with IG Farben, the German chemical conglomerate that would later produce Zyklon B, the gas used in the death camps. According to Ambassador Dodd, Standard Oil sent $2 million to Nazi Germany in December 1933. The company was also making $500,000 a year helping Germany produce synthetic fuel, essential for military vehicles. IG Farben operated factories at Auschwitz using slave labor. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, American corporate investments in Nazi Germany totaled more than $450 million. Major companies with significant German holdings included not only Ford, GM, IBM, and Standard Oil, but also International Telephone and Telegraph, Eastman Kodak, Singer, International Harvester, Gillette, Coca-Cola, Kraft, Westinghouse, and United Fruit. Some of these companies continued operations in Germany throughout the war. Some used slave labor. Some had their German profits held in trust until after the war, at which point they reclaimed them. And here is perhaps the most extraordinary fact. The United States government after the war actually paid Ford and General Motors compensation for damage done by Allied bombers to their German factories. So how did Hitler transform a bankrupt, disarmed nation into a military superpower in just 6 years? Part of the answer lies in creative finance. When Hitler came to power in 1933, unemployment was near 30%. The Nazi government initially continued public works programs begun under previous administrations, funding them through deficit spending. The famous Autobahn system was one such project. But the real transformation came from rearmament. Hitler made rebuilding the military his top priority, and he disguised it as job creation to conceal violations of the Treaty of Versailles. The key figure was Hjalmar Schacht, whom Hitler appointed president of the Reichstag in 1933 and Minister of Economics in 1934. Schacht created a scheme using promissory notes called Mefo bills. These were essentially IOUs that could be used to pay for military equipment without the spending appearing in government budgets. The system worked for a while. Unemployment fell dramatically. By 1938, it was practically non-existent. Industrial production soared. Germans who had suffered through hyperinflation, depression, and mass unemployment experienced what felt like an economic miracle, but it was built on debt and deception. By 1938, the system was straining. A large share of Mefo bills came due, and the government had to force banks to buy bonds and seize money from savings accounts. The Nazi economic model was fundamentally unsustainable without conquest. Hitler believed that the purpose of a country's economy was to enable it to fight and win wars. His entire strategy was oriented toward expansion. The resources Germany needed, particularly oil and iron, would have to be taken from other nations. The conquest of living space in Eastern Europe was not an ideological afterthought. It was an economic necessity built into the structure of the regime. What do we learn from this? First, the Treaty of Versailles was not just a political document. It was an economic weapon that destabilized Europe for 2 decades. The financial system built to enforce it was inherently fragile. When it collapsed, it brought democracy down with it. Second, Hitler's rise was not inevitable. Without the Great Depression, the Nazis might have remained a fringe movement. Economic collapse created the conditions for extremism. Financial crisis paved the path to power. Third, international capital, including American capital, played a direct role in enabling Nazi Germany. The Dawes Plan and the Young Plan pumped billions into Germany without creating sustainable economic structures, and when the credit stopped, catastrophe followed. Finally, American corporate involvement with Nazi Germany was not a minor footnote. Ford, GM, IBM, Standard Oil, and dozens of other companies provided the Third Reich with trucks, technology, fuel, and financing. Some continued doing so even after war broke out in Europe. Their executives received Nazi medals. Their factories used slave labor. And after the war, most faced no serious consequences. This is not conspiracy. This is documented history. The records are in archives. The evidence was presented at Nuremberg. Congressional investigations examined these relationships. The information is available to anyone who looks. But it complicates the clean narrative. It suggests that the Second World War was not simply a battle between good and evil. It was also a crisis produced by systemic economic failures and enabled by profit-seeking businesses that placed their bottom lines above any consideration of morality. 80 years after the war ended, why does any of this matter? Because the forces that produced that catastrophe have not disappeared. Economic instability still creates opportunities for extremism. Financial crises still undermine democracies. Corporations still do business with regimes that violate human rights, and the connections between money and power are still obscured behind layers of complexity that most people never penetrate. The conventional story teaches us to watch for dictators, to defend democracy, to never forget the Holocaust. These are essential lessons, but they are incomplete. The deeper lesson is that catastrophes of this magnitude do not emerge from nowhere. They are built over decades through thousands of individual decisions, most of which seem rational or even beneficial at the time. A treaty designed to ensure peace, loans intended to stabilize an economy, business relationships that create jobs and profits. Each step makes sense in isolation. Together, they create the conditions for disaster. John Maynard Keynes saw it coming in 1919. He wrote, "If we aim deliberately at the impoverishment of Central Europe, vengeance, I dare predict, will not limp." He was right. Vengeance came. 60 million people died, and the economic structures that made it possible were built in large part by the same nations that would later fight to stop it. That is what the textbooks often miss. The war was not just a story of armies and battles, of heroes and villains. It was a story of money, of debts that could not be paid, of capital that flowed where profit beckoned, of economic systems that created political monsters. Understanding this does not diminish the courage of those who fought against fascism. It does not excuse the crimes of the Nazi regime. But it does remind us that preventing the next catastrophe requires more than military strength or moral clarity. It requires understanding how economic forces shape political outcomes, how financial instability creates opportunities for extremism, how the pursuit of profit can enable the worst atrocities. That is a lesson worth remembering, because the next crisis is always closer than we imagine. If you want to understand not just the dates and the battles, but the forces that actually shaped the war, subscribe to Echoes of World War II, the History Vault. We uncover the hidden currents of history, new documentaries every week.